The death of an icon who transformed Hollywood forever and paved the way for change.
I ain't building no chapel.
Yeah, you.
Not only am
Says
I
Sidney
ain't building
Poitier
no
was the
chapel,
first black actor to win an Oscar and open doors for others in a series of groundbreaking roles.
He changed my life. He changed the world. He definitely changed the playing field when it comes to black actors.
We'll be looking back on a life whose effects went far beyond the silver screen. Also in News at 10 tonight. Continued protests in Kazakhstan. The president issues a shoot-to-kill order and he's backed by Russian troops. On the front line in the NHS crisis, Emily sees firsthand the struggle to care for patients.
At present, we're managing. I don't know how long we can manage as we are at present.
Benjamin Mendy, the Manchester City star accused of rape, is freed on bail. And
the name is Pond. James Pond.
From China with love. But is their 007 spoof more of a damp squib?
This is ITV News at 10 with Rageh Omaar.
Good evening. When the actor Sidney Poitier began filming on Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in the mid-1960s about a white woman who brings her black boyfriend home to meet her parents, mixed-race marriages were actually still illegal in 17 American states. So his death today at the age of 94 not only robs the film industry of one of the last surviving icons of Hollywood's so-called golden age, a star whose name above the title spelled box office success, but as someone who was born in Miami to a family of tomato farmers from the Bahamas and became the first black performer to win a Best Actor Oscar, Sidney Poitier was also one of the great groundbreaking actors in the history of cinema, paving the way for a generation of black stars who would follow him. Former President Barack Obama, who himself broke barriers for black Americans in politics, said he epitomized dignity and grace. The Scottish pop star Lulu, who worked with him on the film To Sir with Love, summed up his charisma with the simple words, "He had such a presence."
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
He was an extraordinary presence.
You and your whole lousy generation believes the way it was for you is the way it's got to be.
A matinee idol.
Mom, this is John.
An actor whose visibility in Hollywood would be profound and influential.
I ain't building no chapel.
Yeah, you.
In 1964, Sir Sidney Poitier made history, becoming the first black man to win a Best Actor Oscar.
The winner is Sidney Poitier.
Quietly dignified, he was all too aware of the milestone.
It is a long journey to this moment.
Decades later, those that followed paid tribute.
Always be chasing you, Sidney. I'll always be following in your footsteps. There's nothing I would rather do, sir. Nothing I would rather do.
Raised in the Bahamas, Poitier came to Hollywood at a time when black actors were often given bit parts. He would defy the odds and become a lead man. In 1958's The Defiant Ones, opposite Tony Curtis, he got an historic Oscar nomination. But it would be in the 60s when Poitier became a top-earning box office draw.
I'm a police officer.
His roles would often confront racism head-on. In the heat of the night, his character met bigotry with controlled anger and reason.
You aren't taking me anywhere, you dig? You're holding the wrong man.
And in the same year, 1967, came another milestone, as he was cast as part of an interracial couple, still a rarity at that time in mainstream Hollywood.
I say you ought to sit down before you fall down, Emmy.
He thinks you're going to faint because he's a Negro.
For those watching him, he was a game changer.
He was someone to aspire to. He was my North Star when it came to possibility. No matter how many obstacles I was clearly surrounded by, I had a person, I had a symbol to look to keep me focused on what it is I ultimately hoped for myself.
He was a civil rights supporter. He marched on Washington, but Sir Sidney Poitier's star power made a statement of its own. The cast of the racially charged To Sir With Love, filmed in England, were awestruck. His 17-year-old co-star said the experience changed her life.
I say the Beatles gave me my first break and Sidney Poitier gave me my second break. He introduced me to the whole world. I could go anywhere in the world and people go, Lulu from To Sir With Love?
He was awarded America's highest civilian honour. He was also knighted in 1974. Today, Barack Obama praised his dignity and grace. Sir Sidney Poitier was a pioneer, a man who paved the way.
Sir Sidney Poitier, who died today. Now, yesterday, it looked as though Kazakhstan, in the grip of a harsh military crackdown on social unrest, was fast becoming the latest dangerous flashpoint on Russia's borders. Moscow sent paratroopers to help suppress the protests and support its ally. That seems to have emboldened the country's president, who today declared that his security forces had now been given orders to shoot to kill, heightening international concern. Tonight, though, it seems that barring scattered gunfire and some explosions, Kazakhstan has gone quiet. It remains unclear, though, whether it's an ominous quiet.
Stun grenades in Almaty. Another day of unprecedented violence in Kazakhstan. With the internet cut, the flow of pictures, of information is patchy. But whatever the truth, the government's tone is clear and is escalating. Today, the president decided to allow the police to open fire without warning.
Террористы по-прежнему наносят ущерб государственному и частному имуществу, применяют оружие в отношении граждан. Правоохранительным органам и армии мною дан приказ открывать огонь на поражение без предупреждения.
His justification seemed to be his claim that these weren't ordinary citizens, but armed militants, terrorists. The time and the location of emerging images can be difficult to verify, but here the man with the microphone says, today is the 7th of January. Across the country, like here in the West, protests appear to have continued despite the threats from the government. These protests were triggered by a sharp rise in fuel prices. But the frustrations behind the fury have evolved. Inequality, poverty, corruption. Much of the anger is aimed at the political elite, and not just the current president. The previous president's statue was toppled this week, and today diplomatic sources couldn't say whether or not he was still in the country. Coming into the country, the military of neighbouring Kyrgyzstan, which released this video. They've joined the so-called peacekeeping mission led by Russia. But in some European capitals and beyond today, there's concern about how this will end.
Nous avons appelé à la désescalade.
Many leaders saying lethal force by the government of Kazakhstan can only be a last resort. Few governments are hoping for anything other than stability, because most don't have a full understanding of how this violence escalated so quickly or how it will end. Rohit Katru, News at 10.
Kazakhstan, a huge country the size of Western Europe with vast mineral wealth, lies within a strategic region where tensions have been rising sharply of late. Dominating the area is, of course, Russia, whose huge military might is very much a factor for the former Soviet states along its borders, such as Ukraine and Belarus, as well as now, for differing reasons, Kazakhstan. To get an idea of Russia's influence, just consider one statistic: the 3.5 million military personnel at its disposal. So it can easily afford to deploy the 2,500 troops it calls a peacekeeping force sent into Kazakhstan at the invitation of the government there. But a far greater force of around 100,000 Russian troops and military equipment are also massed near the border with Ukraine. Unlike Kazakhstan, there's no invitation for them to be there. Earlier this evening, I spoke to the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, and I began by asking him if NATO is now facing Russian expansionism on two fronts, in Kazakhstan and on Ukraine's border.
I think we should be careful comparing too much Ukraine and Kazakhstan, and I will not speculate to what extent what happens in Kazakhstan will have any impact on Russia's behavior towards Ukraine. That, of course, we are following very closely the developments in Kazakhstan. We are concerned and we regret very much the loss of lives.
What's the threat to NATO and other Western allies if the situation in Kazakhstan does not stabilise and you see more of a aggressive Russian involvement to prop up the Kazakh government?
That in itself is not a direct threat against NATO, but of course it is of concern because stability is important for peace in general, and we are concerned when we see that human rights are violated and when people are killed.
There are a series of important meetings next week on Ukraine between NATO, Russia and the United States. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has described it as a critical week in Europe's security. Do you agree with her?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Foreign Secretary Liz Truss because it is important that we now sit down with Russia and engage in dialogue. We will not compromise on core principles for European security, including the right for every nation to choose its own path. But the meetings next week will be important to see if we can make progress on the political path, preventing the use of military force against Ukraine.
The problem you face when you talk to Russia next week is that you don't have any good options, isn't it? Because the worst-case scenario is if Russia invades Ukraine, to which there can probably be no use of force. But if Vladimir Putin doesn't invade, but just masses his troops, it keeps the pressure up and keeps you talking to him without any sort of stick to follow the carrot.
Well, I think we need to be clear. NATO's main responsibility is to defend and protect all allies, and we do that every day. And after Russia's aggression against Ukraine in 2014, we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defence in a generation with combat-ready battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance, one of them led by the United Kingdom. This sends a strong message of our commitment to defend all allies, and we are able to do so, and we prevent an attack on NATO allies. That's our core task. Ukraine as a partner, we support them, we help them, but that's a different task to provide support to a partner than to provide absolute security guarantees for all allies.
The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg speaking to me earlier today. Here, a crisis of an altogether different kind continues to threaten to overwhelm the NHS frontline in England. According to figures released today, between Christmas and New Year, tens of thousands of hospital staff were off work because of COVID. A breathtaking 60% rise in absences across that one holiday week. There is some good news, though. Experts are saying tonight a fourth COVID jab may not be needed for older people and care home residents after evidence that existing booster vaccines offer good protection against the more severe effects of Omicron. But the problem is just the sheer volume of cases.
No one thought they were immune. It was only a matter of time. The Omicron wave has hit the West Midlands, and New Cross Hospital in Wolverhampton is treating its victims.
The younger patients predominantly that are coming through to COVID wards are the ones who have not been vaccinated.
There were 27 patients last week. Now there are 100, and ward space is at a premium.
In the last week, we have seen a sharp increase in the number. So while we had only one ward looking after COVID patients, the Trust had to open up more than one ward.
But it's not just the number of COVID patients that's causing the problem, it's the indirect effect of COVID that means places like this are struggling. From staff sickness to bed shortages to dealing with the backlog, it's a multitude of reasons which are not going away.
Ringing to see if one of your beds is ready yet for one of our patients.
On the acute ward, Rashpal is used to juggling bed space.
How many patients have you got waiting?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's about 26 at the moment.
26 patients waiting
from
to come up here from A&E.
What she's not so used to is having to do this with 11% of her colleagues across the hospital either off sick or isolating.
So you're not operating full staff?
No. We were short today, but we've managed to sort it out, and people have come in to help us today.
You've called people in today?
Yeah.
In fact, COVID-related staff absences more than tripled in the last month in England, rising from just over 11,000 to more than 39,000. 16% of hospital beds were taken up by patients staying for more than 3 weeks, adding to pressures on bed capacity, which, not including critical care, were at 91% during the same time.
2 of the patients cannot be taken by Athol today due to extreme staff sickness.
In her third meeting of the day, Louise is trying to discharge dozens of patients into care homes, but half of them in the area are closed because of COVID.
We have 131 patients in the trust who are medically fit for discharge. We're unable to discharge them safely into the community.
So you're a bit like a balloon at the moment. You are filling up from the bottom. You're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Do you think at some point you're going to burst?
At present, we're managing. I don't know how long we can manage as we are at present.
I don't think that is the answer.
Our main issue is actually how do we staff that? Because we're struggling to staff all our inpatient areas at the moment. So realistically, we need to get people out of beds the way we can staff at the moment rather than adding more capacity that will just be really difficult to staff.
This hospital hopes it won't need the army to help out. It's doing all it can to avoid it, but nothing, of course, is guaranteed. Emily Morgan, News at 10 in Wolverhampton.
A French international footballer on Manchester City's books was freed on bail today ahead of his trial for rape. Benjamin Mendy, who was brought by his club for a fee reportedly in excess of £50 million, is accused of a number of sexual offences, including 7 counts of rape relating to 4 women. He had been held in prison since first being charged last August.
After spending 134 days in custody, the Manchester City star is heading home. At a private hearing, Benjamin Mendy was, on his 4th attempt, granted bail. He was arrested and charged in August, accused of 7 counts of rape and 1 of sexual assault between October 2020 and last summer. He joined Manchester City from Monaco in 2017 for £52 million, which at the time was a world record fee for a defender. The France international has had his hands on the World Cup trophy and has rubbed shoulders with his country's president. Tonight, as his Manchester City teammates walked onto the pitch, he was leaving a Manchester prison. Under his bail conditions, he has to live at his house, not contact the complainants and surrender his passport. He had been due to go on trial later this month, but it has now been put back to June at the earliest. Amy Lewis, News at 10.
We're going to take a break now, but still to come. Novak Djokovic breaks his silence from his Australian quarantine hotel. And here, Hillsborough relatives demand a new law preventing cover-ups.
We had obstacles every step of the way, and we had to pay for everything that we went forward with. The families had to pay for.
Those stories and more after the break. Welcome back. Novak Djokovic broke his silence tonight to thank his fans for their support as he spends Orthodox Christmas alone in an Australian immigration hotel. The world's #1 tennis player received calls from family and friends while his legal team continues to try to prevent his deportation so he can compete in the Australian Open. Djokovic, who claims he was granted medical exemption from the country's COVID vaccine requirements, was barred from entry at Melbourne Airport.
As Novak Djokovic endured a second full day at a rundown detention hotel, outside fans attempted to lift his spirits on what is Serbia's Christmas Day. Djokovic finally broke his silence, posting, "Thank you to people around the world for your continuous support. I can feel it and it is greatly appreciated." At Serbia's parliament, the world #1's parents led a rally as this controversy moves from sporting saga to diplomatic incident.
He will win if he stays. Just depends if they are going to let him to play or not. We'll see. We have to wait.
Yesterday they claimed Djokovic was effectively a prisoner, a charge given short shrift by the Australian government.
Mr Djokovic is not being held captive in Australia. He is free to leave at any time that he chooses.
Djokovic hasn't revealed his vaccination status, but it's believed he travelled to Melbourne in the belief a recent COVID infection gave him a medical exemption. But today it emerged in November, the health minister told Tennis Australia that people who contracted COVID-19 within the past 6 months, but who hadn't had the required doses of recognised vaccines, are not considered fully vaccinated. However, in an email recently to overseas players, Tennis Australia seemed to suggest the opposite. It read, "You may be eligible for a temporary medical exemption if you have recently been infected." Czech player Renata Voráková has now also been detained and her visa cancelled. She'd already been in Australia for a month. Djokovic faces 2 more days before he can stretch his legs. On Monday, a court will decide whether that will be in Australia or somewhere else. Steve Scott, News at 10.
More pressure was heaped on the Prime Minister Boris Johnson today on 2 fronts. Tonight, the Prime Minister's former chief advisor Dominic Cummings made fresh allegations about another Downing Street social event he said took place during last year's lockdown. The existing Whitehall investigation into parties that may have broken lockdown rules is now to include the new claim about an alleged gathering on May the 20th. It came as Labour called for a parliamentary standards investigation into an exchange of text messages between Mr Johnson and a top Tory donor.
Not many people can pick up their phone and message a friend asking for thousands of pounds to do up your home in designer gear, but that is what Boris Johnson did in November last year. The question now is whether his exchange with a Tory donor amounts to corruption. In the WhatsApp messages with Lord Brownlow, the PM wrote, "Parts of our flat are still a bit of a tip, and I'm keen to allow designer Lulu Little to get on with it. PS, and this is the crucial bit, I'm on the Great Exhibition plan." To which David Brownlow replied, "Thanks for thinking of GE2.
There's a wealth of attractions to be enjoyed, and surely it can't always be wet and chilly."
GE2, or the Great Exhibition 2, was an idea of Lord Brownlow's to recreate an event first held in 1851, celebrating British culture and technology. 6 weeks after the PM sent that WhatsApp message, we now know Lord Brownlow was granted a meeting with this man, the then Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden, to discuss his idea.
Is this corruption, Mr Dowden?
Labour say it amounts to cash for access.
It looks very much as if Lord Brownlow had access to the Prime Minister because he was paying for the refurbishments to the tune of £100,000 to be carried out on his flat. If that's the case, it's corruption, pure and simple.
Downing Street today denied Lord Brownlow was granted the meeting because he gave the Prime Minister money and confirmed the government did not pursue his ideas.
Well, I think the important thing from the report that's been published by Lord Guide is that, first of all, that he saw that there was no conflict of interest whatsoever, and also that the ministerial code has been met at all times.
And if it's not Downing Street wallpaper, it's Downing Street parties. Tonight, we understand the investigation into alleged gatherings here in 2020 will look at yet another date, on May 20th, where officials are said to have broken lockdown rules holding organised drinks. So far, 2022 may not be proving the fresh start Boris Johnson so desperately wanted. Daniel Hewitt, News at 10.
Tributes were paid today to the Labour MP Jack Dromey, who died suddenly at the age of 73. Born in London in 1948, Dromey made his career as a leading figure in the Transport and General Workers' Union before winning his seat in Parliament 12 years ago. He is survived by his wife, the Camberwell and Peckham MP Harriet Harman, and 3 children. In a statement released this afternoon, they said he was a much-loved husband, father and grandfather who would be greatly missed. 2 former Prime Ministers, Gordon Brown and Theresa May, today gave their support to the campaign for a new Hillsborough law. The law would try to ensure justice for families who lose loved ones in disasters like Hillsborough by introducing a statutory duty of candour on public servants. Renewed calls for action have been prompted by the ITV drama Anne, about the Hillsborough campaigner Anne Williams, whose 15-year-old son Kevin died in the disaster.
Sergeant, I have been led to believe for a year that my son died in that crush in the pen.
A drama watched by millions that tells of one woman's fight for justice. The real-life story of activist Anne Williams capturing the horror of losing her son at Hillsborough and the hurt of the cover-up that followed. Anne didn't live to see the day that her son's death was recorded as unlawful killing. after a fight that went on for 27 years. But today, those she campaigned alongside came together to try to stop others going through the same struggle.
We had obstacles every step of the way, and we had to pay for everything that we went forward with. The families had to pay for. What a disgrace. That should never happen.
In the aftermath of a major disaster like Hillsborough, the new law would give families access to funding for legal representation and force police officers and public officials to proactively tell the truth. It draws on the conclusions of a report commissioned by former Prime Minister Theresa May nearly 6 years ago, and now supporters are keen to build momentum.
For every Anne Williams, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of parents going through the same. Hillsborough, Grenfell, contaminated blood, you could reel off a whole number of injustices that just go on and on for years because the system is stacked against ordinary families seeking the truth.
Kevin, how many times do you have to be told? You're too young.
Even members of the cast today backed the calls for change.
I think a lot of people felt a righteous anger watching it as well as being moved by. I think it's made a lot of people sort of sit back up again and realise that some things do have to change.
This drama's exposed a struggle faced by families ripped apart
and find out what is
justice, as well as the tragedy of their loss. Hannah Miller, News at 10.
In football, a couple of familiar faces are returning to the Premier League after spells at two of Spain's biggest clubs. Aston Villa have agreed to sign the former Liverpool star Philippe Coutinho on loan from Barcelona. He'll be reunited with his old teammate Steven Gerrard, now in charge at Villa Park. Meanwhile, England international Kieran Trippier has joined Newcastle from Atletico Madrid. He's the club's first signing since the Saudi-backed takeover, and it represents another reunion. Manager Eddie Howe previously signed Trippier for Burnley way back in 2011. Finally, the UK's top spooks have been telling us lately that the global activities of China are fast becoming their biggest concern. So what prompted the head of MI6 to thank China publicly this week? Well, before we start toasting a new détente, let's just say the clue lies in a new Chinese-made James Bond spoof.
What a beautiful castle for a secret rendezvous, Agent 0.07.
He may be a vodka short of a martini, but here's China's take on our famous fictional spy.
The name is Pond, James Pond.
To summarise the plot, a remodelled Agent 0.07 plus glamorous sidekick.
He's obviously shaken his turn now.
Unmask Britain's real rivals, and they turn out to be our cousins at the CIA.
To be America's friend is fatal.
Rather than the communists of Beijing.
7. And remember,
the skit was shared by the usually straight-laced Chinese news agency and earned a swift riposte from the actual head of Britain's intelligence agency. Richard Moore tweeted, "Thank you for your interest and the unexpected free publicity," along with a link to the speech he made that so riled Beijing last year.
Adapting to a world affected by the rise of China is the single greatest priority for MI6.
The real film franchise does brisk business in China. One reason there hasn't been a Chinese Bond villain.
You damaged my organization.
Since a supposedly Chinese Dr. No way back in the days of Sean Connery. So does Britain's best-known cinematic envoy make an effective agent for Chinese soft power?
Professor Sang, we meet at last.
China watchers have their doubts.
Who's the villain of this piece, do you think?
I think the real villain in the piece is the propaganda department of the Communist Party. It's not the Chinese people who don't have a sense of humor, it's the Communist Party that doesn't have the sense of humor. And they are trying to pretend that they have on this occasion.
Why do you suddenly have a British accent now?
Still, we can be sure that China's real spies are rather better than the spoof. John Ray, News at 10.
Well, we can see why the head of MI6 was so keen to thank the Chinese news agency for their contribution. That's it. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.